Hello, and welcome to Finsweet Live Build Day. It is Friday, it's 9 a.m. Eastern, and as every Friday, we're joined with Finsweet CTO Alex Iglesias. Alex is going to be
Hey,
talking about Webflow forms with a technical deep dive. There's a simple side to Webflow forms, and then there's a technical side to Webflow forms. And Alex is a pure master at it. So he's going to be really walking us through a lot of what this means. What are Webflow forms in a technical sense? Alex, how are you? How are you feeling?
I'm great. Can I make a small change to what you were saying? Because Webflow
Yeah.
forms are not Webflow forms, are just forms, and Webflow is just presenting them. We don't want people to be thinking that a Webflow form is something specific to Webflow. But yeah, we'll be deep diving into forms themselves. So I'm hoping that everyone understands what's actually a form and today with this, and not the magical just UI that you're seeing by just inputting some stuff and then magically sending that to your Webflow project backend, since that will be doing some deep dives on that. So yeah, I'm super excited.
Good. And that's a good clarification because I think Webflow is so good that it does give us this impression that sometimes there's magic happening in the background or just in front of us. And we don't really know exactly what's
Yeah,
happening, but we know it works and we know the published page looks great. So yeah, this is really important to understand this difference between um, well, not difference, but just the idea of what is a web form. And we're going to really
yeah.
talk a lot about that from a technical perspective. So let's say hello to some people in the audience today. Hello, Babis. How are you? Nice to see you. Felix, great topic. Looking forward to learn some tips on Webflow forms. Good, me too. Nice to see you, Felix. Michael Rose, hello, happy Friday. We have Frank, great subject. Never thought enough about forums. Frank, I'm glad you said that. If you have not thought enough about forums, you're not thinking enough because forums need to be thought about. This is so important. Like I said, we can take the easier route and just understand the basics of it, and we could do most projects with that. But once we get that deeper understanding, it's almost like your opportunities just expand. You could do more with projects, you can offer more to clients, you can use forms and solutions that you wouldn't really think forms should be used for. So, Frank, I'm glad you said this. Now you're going to start thinking about them more. Great. And we have Dale Jensen. Hello, hello. How you doing? Maurice, hello. My favorite sprint. Great. Bullshark Creative. Looking forward to today's stream. Thank you very much. We have Mika. Hello, hola, hola. And we have Christian. Hello, Finsweet people. Caleb, nice. Seeing a lot of the regulars here and also seeing a lot of new people. Really nice. Hey Penny, how's it going? Great. Okay, that's a nice hello to everybody. Let's get right into this content here. So,
Nice.
Alex, please tell us, give us a little bit of an overview of what we are going to learn today.
Yeah. So I think that our main goal is for people to understand what's a form. What is a form used for? What things can you do with a form, and then see how does a form work in the background, so you understand exactly what's going on with that form. What Webflow does for us to make it look like it's magic, as you said. I love that sentence. Webflow just makes it seem very, very easy, and I do have a story for that. Um, and then we could see just a few tricks and things that maybe cool stuff that we could do with forms. How about that? So yeah, I think that we could start by defining what's a form, right? um So usually people just think that a form it's something where people can contact you in your website. You know, the usual contact form, and that's it. People doesn't go past that. But a form, the definition of a form, it's a component that allows users to submit data through on your website, and that data it's not only meant for contact forms. It could be for anything. Could be any application nowadays, any kind of input that requires from your site. For example, in Webflow, let's pick Webflow as an example. In Webflow, when you pick an element and you need to add an attribute, that would be a form. In Webflow, when you need to, for example, set up an ID for an element, you're inputting some data. That's a form. And when you need to, for example, save a collection item, when you're creating a new collection item or editing it, that's a form. You're submitting a form with that with data. So a form is just a way of taking a user's data and processing it the way whatever you need to do with that data. That's the main goal. So this opens up a wide range of application use cases, not only for contact forms themselves, but for building whatever you need. Especially web applications rely a lot on forms because you need to have some inputs from the user. So that's the main definition of form. Something that can pick that where you as a user can submit some data and the owner of that website can process it somehow whenever you submit that data. um is that clear? If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them, because this is like the basis, and from that we can start, deep diving a little bit more into these forms. um
That's a great definition, a really great explanation. And please, anybody in the audience throughout the entire episode, if you have questions, if something is not clear, ask it. And we may not get to all the questions, but we will bring up questions. So ask. And I just want to point out something really great that you said. Once you start thinking about forms not only as contact forms, but ways for a user to submit data in any way that you want, that's when it starts to open up what the possibilities are. Right? We can just be in the world of contact forms, and we can do most of our projects with just contact forms. But once we take it to that next level, once we start thinking about submitting any type of data, now we're coming up with new and unique solutions using forms. So, Alex, I love how you explain that.
Nice. But we could start by, exploring a little bit what Webflow offers us, how we can use forms in Webflow. And then I think that we could try to push it a little bit more and try to see other applications for what Webflow offers out of the box. Um, so if I could share my screen, I think that we can start with just a simple project, blank project. I cloned client first v2 to create this new project with this form. The only thing that I did was just drop in a form element. This is the one that you can find here, or by using the command palette here. Now let's dive a little bit into what's going on here and what is Webflow doing differently than what's native. Go ahead,
Can
Joe.
you do one more zoom for me, please?
I think so.
You can call people are going to start calling me Mr. Zoom. Not that's a little too much. Yeah,
Yeah.
that extra zoom really helps me. Thank you.
Cool. So we dropped a form on the page. And first of all, we have the first magic happening with Webflow because a form block, it's not anything. It's just a dev block. Just be aware of that. The actual form component that we are going to be interacting with in Webflow and on the side, it's what's called a form. And there's a reason why Webflow does this of wrapping everything inside a form block, but we'll get to that in a second. But because many people, I've seen it many times that do this with the form, and then people just goes ahead and does it on the form block. I mean, because it's the form block. That's a form. It's a little bit confusing, but let's just inspect that for a second. and we'll see that the form block, which is what's wrapping everything, it's just a div. I don't know if you can see it, but it's just a regular div here. The component that we are interested in, it's the form element, which is this one in here, that one. And so we had a definition. We said, okay, the form it's something that you can use to submit data. So the server of that website can process that data, or the front end also can process it with JavaScript. Um, but inside the form, we need some blocks to allow users to submit the data, right? Because it's not only about giving a blank canvas. We need to ask questions. I loved when we were planning for form logic, you were trying to think about questions instead of form inputs. I think that's a great example, a great way of defining what's a form input. It's just something that you're asking the user to give you through that form. Could be regular text strings, but as many of you will probably know, because if you've been diving into a little bit into the elements that Webflow provides, you can be passing numbers, emails, passwords. You can be submitting files. You can be checking checkboxes, checking radios, selecting from a select drop down, etc. So these are just different ways of you know asking the user, asking a question to the user, like, hey, can you please submit this data that I'm requesting in this specific format. So in Webflow we can add a bunch of them. There's a bunch of input elements that we can add. I want to start with the ones that are native, because right now we're focusing just on Webflow, but there are many more that Webflow does not allow us to use, and which is a pity. But we can use them through HTML custom HTML embeds. So we'll get to that. First, when you create a form, the first two inputs that you have, it's this two, the name and the email address. This is the first thing that that you find when you're dropping a form in on the page. These two, as much as they are seem to be different, they are both the same thing. They are called an input. Inputs, it's what the name says. It's an element that's asking the user to input something, to type something in, to manually have to input that data. And we can see that there are a bunch of types of that. So we have the plain, which is in reality it's called the text type, which is just a regular empty input where you could just type any data. But then the same input element has different types, and as I showed before, Webflow allows us to use 5 types, which is email, well, the plain email, password, phone, and number. The main difference between all of this, it's essentially how is this data going to be validated when we submit it. And also the input element can behave a little bit different based on the type that we're assigning, because it's not the same if we're requiring for just some text, or if we're requiring for a number, right? When we're requiring for a number, what happens? The browser is smart about it and knows that this is a number, so automatically we have some extra controls about how we can input this data, in a sense that I cannot type any text inside this. I can only type, I think that the E, it's because of exponential, but we can only type numbers and we can move this with the arrows. Same happens, for example, if we change this to something like password. This means that we are expecting the user to input a password here, so we need some kind of protection. Now I cannot see what's going on here with the passwords, although we can still see it. I'll show you a cool trick later about this. Um, and for example, same for phones. I think that the phone number behaves exactly as a text. But this is the perfect example of not only talking about the type of inputs that we're using, but also how does that data submit? I mean, how does the browser process this data when we're submitting a form? Because the steps that happens is You first present the form to the user. You're asking the user just inputs the data, but the moment that you want to submit that data, the browser needs to make sure that this data it's following the types, the guidelines that you defined, right? You wouldn't like to be asking for an email address and then the user to type a phone number. You're expecting an email address to be here, right? Or if you're expecting a number, you don't want to be receiving a string. Or if you're expecting a telephone, you're expecting something that has a telephone format. So what happens is that the moment that you click on submit or you hit enter with here on the form, the browser is going to check the validity of all these inputs to make sure that what you're submitting it's what was expected for you to submit. And this is very powerful because many times people relies on I need to ask for something, but people is not following my guidelines. We'll see a bunch of tips for that. But the first step is to define a proper field type. Whenever you're asking for data, you need to make sure that where you're asking to the user, it's something that it's what you were expecting to receive. Um, let's finish up the rest of the inputs that you can use in Webflow, and after that, I think that we can go through questions if you see any. Because we've talked about inputs, but there are more. There is the text area, and if you guess what that is doing, I hate the drag and drop. Just come on. Okay, like that. Um, the text area, it's just saying I want the user to be able to submit some text, but in this case, it's going to be a long text. I want the user to be able to just skip lines, you know, and in this case, I think it's not possible, but we will see that there is we can modify the element to be able to do it. Um, Another thing that we can use is the select dropdown, which, as the name says, it's just an input where we define all the options that are available. And in that case, the user is forced to be choosing from one of these options that we've defined. Another thing that we can use it's the checkboxes. So checkbox, come on, come on. Okay, checkbox it's something that the user can check or uncheck to define, to answer any questions that you're asking to the user. And finally, the last thing that we can do with a free plan, it's the radio buttons. So the radio buttons would be here. And in the case of radio buttons, this is meant so we can just answer one single question, one single answer between multiple options, which is kind of similar to a select dropdown if you think about it. You have a bunch of options and you can just select one of them. Um, I think that those are the main ones because the next one it's a file upload, and then we have the form button, and then the reCAPTCHA, which is actually not any form element itself. Okay, Joe, any questions so far?
Yes, let's go over some questions here. So let's. Some people have some more specific questions, and I think these are good to answer in a sense of forms. So Mike is
Yeah.
asking, how do you submit data to secure APIs with Webflow? I currently use Zapier
Mhm.
to solve this problem, but I'm wondering if you have a cheaper solution. So, just to refresh this question for
Mhm.
everybody listening, it's taking a form on the page and sending that form information to an API. So, Alex, how would you do that?
Okay, this gives me the. Let's go to the next thing that I wanted to explain, and it's how does a Webflow a form work? What's happening when you're submitting a form. Let's go. Let me just first explain that, and then we'll see ways of taking advantage of this behavior to post data to an external API like this user is asking. Let me refresh this page. Okay, so you have a form. you have the page, you want to submit that form. Out of the box, this is going to behave differently than what it's expected natively, because Webflow is doing some magic stuff in the background. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable JavaScript just for a second, because Webflow is using JavaScript to process this form. And what I'm going to do is I will just submit this form right away. Let's just type something random here. And remember, we're not, I just disabled JavaScript. So what's going to happen now when we submit the form, it's a native behavior of the form element. Check what happens. I submit the form, and then many people will probably have seen is that the page has reloaded with some random query parameters here on the page, right? The page actually did not reload per se. What happened is that the form made a request to the server, sending the data of the form with it. So let's go back 1 second to the form. We have a setting here that it's called the method when tweaking the settings of the form, where we can define how are we sending that data. And we have two options. We have using an HTTP GET request or an HTTP POST request. And let's define those. And I'm sorry if it seems like I'm going down through a rabbit hole, but I need to explain this so people understand exactly what's going on before reaching the point where we submit this data to an API. These HTTP methods are just defining how we are taking this data and we are sending it to the whatever end where we're sending this data. In the case of a GET request, we're just saying that we will load the page, we will request the URL that targets this form, and with that request, we will be appending the form data as just a query string. So this means that we're just taking a URL like this, and we're taking the data that it's inside this form, and we're saying, okay, I'm going to get this URL again, but now I will be also appending my form data. And I know that this is very small and I don't know how to zoom in, so I'll just paste it in here. But if we check, what we had here, it's the URL and then just some query parameters. Let me zoom in a little more. And here we have defined the data of the form. Let's submit it again just for disable. Let's just say Alex, and let's say Alex.example. Oh, this is the text area. I'll just say, hey, like that. Okay. Let's take this again. We did a GET request. And with that GET request, we just added the form data as a query string saying that the name is equals to Alex and the field, which is this in here, it's equals to hey, like this. And you can see that there is some escaping of the characters to make it URL friendly, but that's it. We're just taking this data and the form is natively calling a random URL. Now, the first question that you probably have is, okay, but this is calling the same URL that we are in, right? The reason why this is happening is because we have not defined any actions on the form. You can see that I need to go through these settings here so people understand what's going on. The action of a form, it's just defining that specific URL where we are sending the data. That's it. By default, because we have not defined any action and because I have disabled JavaScript, what the form is doing, it's just, okay, there's no action. I have no idea what to do with this data. I will just send it to the same URL that we are currently. But if we define an action, let's say, for example, let's say Finsweet.com, and let's publish this like that. Now, what we're saying with this is, okay, when we submit the data, I want the browser to send the data to finsweet.com. This is the main target, finsweet.com. Now, what's going to happen is, let's refresh. Let's put Joe. Cool. And when we submit this, now we're not being redirected to Finsweet. Don't be confused with that. We are actually getting, we're sending a GET request to the finsweet.com website saying, okay, hey, finsweet.com, I'm sending your request. And also with me, I have here this in my backpack. I have some data that you can process if you want to. Okay. I know that this sounds a little bit confusing, but this is what's happening. We're taking a target action, a target URL, and we're saying, okay, we have some data. I want to send that data to that target action. And I think people is saying that we are having some connection
Yes.
issues.
Yes, and it seems to be on the YouTube side because here on our end, we're not having any issues. But yeah, I think a lot of people are not really catching this full episode. It's in and out, blurry screen, cutting out, lagging. So
It's
I don't
fine
know.
now, they're saying.
Do we reschedule this? It's kind of hard to follow one of these tutorials without a being
Huh.
able to see it.
I mean, can we ask people like, hey, um,
Yeah,
is this
is it
improving? Is this improving a little bit, or are you still having issues following?
It's back and forth. It seems it's on and it's off and it's on and it's off, and it seems to be once it's going to YouTube, YouTube is not processing it.
Huh.
But Gabe says it's recording on his end. Okay.
Okay.
Um, okay.
I
Well, I
mean,
don't know.
I could.
I- should
Can
should
people?
we end this and then we do something locally and we upload it later, or should we continue? I'd hate to just continue and people can't actually review the content.
But
I see. Yeah,
can people hear us at least? Because in that case, I will just focus on explaining things, instead of relying too much on the screen. Can you hear us? Is it cutting, or is it working fine?
let's see. We have about 7 or 8 seconds until that gets to them. So let's see those answers.
2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, they can hear us well. All right,
Okay,
so maybe we just go explaining this.
let's
It's too
go
bad.
podcast mode.
Okay,
Okay,
podcast mode.
let me just put comfortable here.
All right, Gabe, let's
So
go.
let
Let's go. No screen share. Let's go two people, and let's answer a few questions. There are some questions that are really specific to certain projects. And Alex, I want you to answer this in a really simple way, almost like
Okay,
going through the steps of how this person should do it. But we don't want to be going really deep into these specific problems or specific
okay, yep.
questions. But good questions. Let's bring up from Mika Dixon. Mika's saying, I've been struggling with submitting static elements on the page along with the form, not just labels, but maybe boilerplate on page paragraphs to submit with a contact form. And then he provides more context saying, I was attempting to replace hello bonsai.
And once the page loads, you just use some JavaScript to get the content of those static elements. So, for example, if this is a paragraph, you will be using JavaScript to first get that paragraph and then read the text inside the paragraph and then take that text and put it inside an input. So the moment that you submit the form, that text is going along with the rest of the form elements, and you're able to collect that data. And actually, this is an interesting thing. Many times there's a use case for submitting some kind of hidden questions, hidden elements that gives you some context at the moment that you need to process that data. For example, could be um, just a marketing campaign. You know, Maybe the user is submitting a form, contact form, and you want to know where the user came from. Maybe the user came from Facebook. Maybe the user came from Twitter. Maybe the user came from Google. So the way that you would do the same approach, you would have a hidden question, and you would be reading something like a query parameter in the URL, and you would just say, okay, I have this piece of information. I'll just put it inside the form. It's hidden. The user doesn't really care about this one, but I'm sending this information alongside the rest of the form so I can process it later. So this is the way that you would do it.
Nice. Mika, I hope that was a good answer for you and that gives you a nice path to achieve this. Let's bring this up from Nadir. This is also a JavaScript answer. Nadir
Okay.
is building an eligibility test. Is it possible to aggregate several input fields into one hidden field and display the selected value on a confirmation screen with query param, the attribute solution?
With query param, I would say that with query param, no, you would need some custom JavaScript for this. But yeah, I mean, what you are trying to do of just collecting the data and then at the end of the flow, just showing that data, it's a regular action that you can do with JavaScript. The same way that I said that you could take a static element, read the text, and put it inside a form field. You can do it the other way around. You can read the text from a form field and display it in a static element. And this will be the perfect case for you because what you're trying to do is collecting the data and then showing that data in a some kind of summary UI, something that you're displaying that data to the user to confirm. And in that case, you're doing the same process, but in bursts. You're taking the data from the input that the user inputted, and you're just reading that data and you're showing that data in the UI. So I think that you had kind of two questions with that. The first one is it possible? It is. Can it be done with query param? That's not the main purpose of it. So, I mean, kind of that. I think that this question comes from a potential confusion around the stream that you did with Hershit
Hmm.
about the redirects. You know what I mean? Um,
Yes, yes, that needed more explanation. That that was a big confusion because it wasn't mentioned that the form wasn't being submitted. So, from my understanding, when you submit this form and you go to a new page, you're going to have to use some local storage or cookies to then get that information from one page to the next page.
well, let me clarify something. Because so for the people who has seen the stream about query param, the trick there was kind of it was valid. So as you saw here, when we're submitting a form to a specific URL, and let's do it again. When we're submitting something to a URL, we're sending the data as query parameters to that URL. In this case, I submitted the form, and what it's doing is because I have my action is pointing to Finsweet. Now I'm sending that data to Finsweet with the query params. And in this case, it's possible to use these query params. But the problem is that you're now sending the data to Finsweet instead of sending the data to Webflow. And I think that now it's the moment to explain what is Webflow doing in the background. And after that, I can finally answer the question from Mike about how do you send the data to an API. I know, Mike, that you're waiting. That you're waiting. Don't worry. Um, but let's, because I think that people can see us better now. There is no lag, so let's just do it super quick. um, when we're sending some data, that's the only place where you're sending that data. In my case, I'm defining finsweet.com to send this data. So when I submit this form, I'm sending the data to finsweet.com with some query parameters that contain the data of the form, right? But when we don't define any actions in Webflow, Webflow is smart about this because knows that people usually wants to use forms because of contact forms, things like that, and Webflow already provides us a cool feature, for forms for processing exactly all the form submissions. I think it's down here. Webflow already does the work for us to collect the data because they know that many people wants to use form submissions because of contact or whatever, so in this case, let me just go back to the designer. In this case, if we republish again but we don't use any actions, Webflow is going to detect that. It's going to say, okay, the user is not sending that data specifically anywhere. So we kind of guess that the user wants to use this form to collect, some kind of contact information, to do something, to collect some data from the user in the Webflow project, right? So what happens is that let's just check the network requests. Let me enable again JavaScript, and we will just send this. And let me expect. Whoops, I need to refresh the page. 1 second. I need to remove the action and I need to publish this. And once it's published, I will be able to show you. Okay, do we have JavaScript now? I think so. So let's do it again. And let's check the network requests. I'll just send this. Now Webflow did its magic. So let's see what Webflow did. Let's just inspect the forms, and we can see that Webflow made a request, not to finsweet.com, not to this domain. Webflow did a request to webflow.com/API/v1/form because Webflow is still using the way that the Webflow the form sends the data, but it's processing that data for you. It's doing the job of reading the data that it's coming from this request and storing it and showing it to you in the form submissions, and also sending you an email. You get you receive an email when somebody submits a form. That is Webflow doing magic for you. This is not native forms. This is Webflow processing the data and doing something with it. Okay. So in this case, what Webflow did was send the data still. So we can see here that we have fields name equals to this, fields field, because this is called field. But if we call this text, oops, not in the ID, sorry, in the name, this is important. This will be called text, not field. Okay, so this is just Webflow collecting the data, and that's it. Now, you want to send this data somewhere else, right? In that case, what you do is you set a custom action. With that action, you're saying, okay, I don't want to send that data to webflow.com/API/v1/form. I want to send that data to finsweet.com/whatever, right? And this is what happened when I changed this to finsweet.com, like that. Which brings me back to what I was trying to clarify, which is when you're setting this action, you're no longer sending the data to Webflow. You will not get an email. You will not get. You will not see the form submission in the settings panel. You will not be collecting that data unless the URL that you're defining here somehow is processing the data. That destination is processing the data when you load the page. So be careful when using the query params solution that we provided in that other stream with Hashit, because you're no longer sending the data to Webflow. You're sending that data to the URL that you're defining here. And if you want to send data to an API, what would you do? You would take that API destination, that endpoint of the API, and you would put it here in the action. And you know what? I've prepared a visual, an API myself, so we can show it to people. So people can see exactly how can an API process this data. But first, do we have any questions before jumping into this? Is the stream going well?
We do have questions, but they're not exactly related to this. So why don't you continue here? I think a lot of people are interested in this API concept and how we can send data to APIs. So if you have a good example
Okay.
of that, let's continue.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So we've defined a custom action, right? And now when submitting the form, let's do it again. When submitting the form like that, we're sending the data to that specific URL with the data attached to it, right? Let's use our own API now to process this data. I think that the stream is all lagging again, but or perhaps it's just me
Oh no.
seeing ourselves a little bit lag. Let me know, people, if this is still holding up. But in the meantime, I'll just talk. I'll explain what's going on here, and then you can see it in the screen. What I've done is I've prepared a very quick API endpoint using StackBlitz. StackBlitz, I've talked about this in the past. StackBlitz is just like a cloud solution for for how to explain it non-technical, for just opening a coding editor and also creating a dev server, so you can, for example, spin up an API like I'm doing it right now. And in my case, what I'm doing is I've created an API that the only purpose is to just get a request, read the query. Let me zoom in a bit more. Read the query parameters of that URL of the request, and then just respond with those query parameters. So we're kind of saying, okay, yeah, you can see that I processed this data. It's just mocking an API. So I have the URL here. It's this one. And I will pick this URL and I will use it as the action, like that. Let me publish this. Right now it's smooth. Seems good now. Cool. And let me refresh the page. Okay, so now I will input the data. And when we submit that data, we are going to be we're going to make a GET request to the API endpoint that I created. The API endpoint is going to process the data that I'm sending along with my GET request, and it's going to show me to respond to me just a screen displaying me that data. It's very basic, but it's how an API endpoint would be processing in the most minimal way. Let me just say Alex, hey, like that. I will submit, and if we zoom in, the API processed the query that we have here and said, okay, I got you. I got the data that you're sending. Let me just show it to you. That's it. This is a really bare bones API that it's processing in form submission. That's it. Now, this is kind of it's a pity, right? Because, you know, if every time that we were sending a form submission, we were sent to the API page, that would be like a pain in the ass, right? Because now I need to go back again to my screen. I don't want this to happen. What I want to happen is I want to submit the form, but then I want to stay on the form on the same page. I just want, the browser to send the data, but I don't want to be involved with whatever it's going on with that data. Because right now, if I send a GET request, I'm going to that page. I'm navigating to that page. I don't want that to happen. And here at this moment is where JavaScript comes in, because we are saying now, okay, I still want to send that data, but I don't want to be sent along myself, my session, my navigation. I don't want to go to whatever that data is going. I want to stay on the same page, and I want the browser to handle that for me. So the way that we do this is with JavaScript. We need to use JavaScript to avoid this behavior. Um, some people may have seen it. Maybe some people knows a little bit about JavaScript. Maybe some people does not. But we can just do some very, very, very small coding to show you what we can do with that. Let's just take this form, and let me just pull up the console. We have the form in a variable that's called temp1. Stay with me. We're doing some coding now here in the console. But now I want to say, okay, when the form submits, so we will add an event listener and we'll say unsubmit like this. What we want to do is we want to intercept this event. We want to say, hey, don't go any farther. I want to do something with that before you proceed to send the data to wherever you're going. And now what we're going to do is I want to prevent what's happening by default. So I will say prevent default like that. And ideally, this will work in every website except in Webflow websites. Because so at this point we said, okay, please don't do any form submissions. Just give me the data and I'll send it myself. I don't want you to be sending the data. But if we remember, Webflow uses JavaScript also. So by default, Webflow does something with this form. So I want also Webflow to not act, and I will say stop propagation like this. Stay with me. I know that this is very random, but this is just saying, Webflow, please do not act with this. Just let me do whatever I'm doing. Just don't do anything else. And at this point, what's going to happen is that if I try to submit the form, I'm clicking on it, nothing is happening. Right now, if I try to hit enter, nothing is happening. I cannot submit this form because with JavaScript, we're saying, please don't submit the form. Stop doing whatever you're doing. Let me do my thing, right? And at this point, our job would be to also write some extra custom code like this, where we would say request perform a request to the server with the data using JS. And I think that I don't want to go that route right now because it takes an entire stream. But just know that if you want to submit data yourself doing this, you need to do this step. You need to take the data, stop the form from submitting, and then using JavaScript, send the data yourself. But you know what? And now this is super cool. Now the perfect moment, because we have a solution for this already. We have a solution that's called form enhance. Is that public, Joe? I think it is. It
Yes.
is. Form submit. There's one. It is. So if you're interested in doing this, what I just said, but without JavaScript, just be aware that you can do that using an attribute that it's called form submit, which has an option called enhance. This option. I won't dive into this, but just it's a cool thing that you can use, that it's currently out there. If you set this attribute to the form, you set a custom action, and then you submit the form, the attribute is going to do this JavaScript for you. It's just going to prevent the form from submitting, take the form inputs, and send them to the API for you. You don't need to write any JavaScript. So I think that with this, I'm answering a lot of questions, and I'm wrapping up kind of like how you would send data to an API. But the last thing that I would like to mention, because I would like to just point out a difference between doing this, submitting data directly from the form, and connecting something like Zapier to Webflow. Okay, because so when you're submitting a form, even if it's just Webflow, native Webflow, you're submitting the form. Webflow takes the data and then processes that data. And it's not after Webflow has processed the data that Zapier or any other integration comes in by using something that it's called webhooks. Webflow is just sending an event saying, okay, somebody sent the form submission. Zapier or whoever you are, you can do now some actions with it. This is not the same as processing the form submission. First, the form submission happens, and then after the form submission happens, whatever other things can be happening, like integrations that are reacting to this webhook that Webflow triggers because you submitted a form. This is something that happens because of Webflow. Does not happen because of the form itself. It's Webflow doing it. So just be aware of these differences. Well, the more that I'm talking about forms, the more I'm realizing that I need a 10-hour stream to explain everything that's going on. I'm just super afraid of just confusing people with this much information. Um, but let me know if people is asking any questions, please.
It's a nice overview, and it's nice to know how much Webflow is doing for us behind the dashboard. That this forms on the web don't just work by default. They're working because Webflow has set up that API endpoint for all
Correct.
that data in the form to be sent to their location. So
Yep.
this is really nice that Webflow does this. And then when you have to do it custom, you can see how Alex was just going through these steps. It's not easy. It can get a little technical. It can get very technical.
Yep.
And there's a few questions about WISD. So I'm going to just kind of
Whiz.
group all of these questions
Okay.
together. WISD, and people are saying like, "Hey, can you do this with WISD? Can you does Wiz work like this?" So WISD, it's going to help you send that form submission to different places without writing that code. So Alex is writing some code preventing the default form from submitting and saying, "Hey, instead send it to this location and make sure that these inputs match up with these where we're sending the information to." And what Wiz is going to allow you to do is submit through the form, send all your information to the API that you want, but you just don't have to write the code for it. It takes out that code layer. Alex, is that an accurate description?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Great.
anybody who can write JavaScript or any application who can do the same job for you can apply this behavior of taking the data and just sending it wherever you need. So in the case of Wiz, this is a good example. Definitely.
Well, I'm really happy, Mika, that you keep checking in on some of these topics. It seems that we're really helping out Mika during the stream. There's been a few, oh wow, I think this was what I was missing moments for him. So that's really nice to hear. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. We have a few questions, but they're very specific to specific use cases. And we're not going to go so deep into a specific use case for one person. We have 5 minutes left. Um, let's let's see, Mike. Thank you for the response here, Alex. In 4 minutes, what can we send people off with? That's a really valuable form information.
Um, I think that the what you shared before about saying that Webflow is doing a lot of magic for us, and many functionalities that you're seeing working out of the box on a Webflow site when you publish it. It's not because of the form not only the form. I mean, the form is required, but it's Webflow doing stuff on top of it. And I think that we can recap what Webflow is doing so people understands the difference between a what's a form and then what's Webflow adding on top of the forms. So we can use them the way that we do. The first thing is when you send the data, when you submit a form, unless you specify an action, Webflow is processing that data for you. So it's sending the data to an API, it's processing that data, it's storing that data, it's showing it in the UI of form submission so you can check all the submissions. It sends an email to you saying that you got a new form submission. Check it out. All of these, it's Webflow doing its magic under the hood. Another thing, for example, it's when you submit the form, oops, when you submit natively the form, let's do it again. um, what's happening when you see the thank you page, all of this, the thank you page here, this is not a native form. This is not related to native forms. This is Webflow doing the job for you of showing an element to say thank you, but this is not native. Same when there's an error. In Webflow, we have this error message that we can define. We have these states. This is not a native form. This is Webflow using JavaScript to show this element whenever there's an error. Um, so just be aware of the difference between what's a native form and what Webflow is doing for you. And I think that this then will solve many questions that people asks when they export the site. When you export the custom code of a site, and the first thing that Webflow says is forms are not going to work. I've seen many times before, like people asking, but why? Why the hell is it not working? That's just because Webflow, it's not there. You've exported the code, and now this form is just a native form, regular form. It's not doing. It's not. There's Webflow. It's not behind doing its magic for you. So understanding exactly how a form works is just going to make you a better developer. So you can know exactly how does it behave when Webflow is not doing magic for you. Did I make a good summary, Joe?
Yeah, that's a good summary. Webflow does a lot for us, and sometimes we don't even know it. So yeah, that's we use Webflow forms all the time. If a client doesn't have a preference or we can use it for our use case, we'll use Webflow forms. It's a great service. It really does a lot of that heavy work for you. So yes, forms is a huge topic. We only have an hour here. We touched on some really nice topics. I really hope you learned something. But really, this
Mhm.
is this is something that could be talked about for weeks and weeks and weeks.
I really thought that in this stream I would have time to talk a little bit more about form elements, because in Webflow you just see a bunch of elements like text inputs, text areas, things like that. But there are a lot of different types like dates, like color pickers, like date pickers, like range sliders. And in the same inputs we have a lot of different options that we can use, like maximum values, minimum values, patterns that needs to match, many things like this. So I really think that we could do other streams talking about just some basic stuff that people can do without JavaScript. And after that we could also do some other things with JavaScript, so people can go from not knowing what the hell a form is to knowing how to set up a form with some cool tricks, and then to know how to use the forms to implement some kind of functionality on the site. I think that would be cool. What do you think, guys? Asking to the
Yeah,
audience if there's anybody who's interested.
I
But yeah, I'm pretty
I
sure
like
that
that. That sounds nice.
nice.
That's great. We're at the top of the hour, so we are going to start closing down this stream. And next week we are going to talk about using JavaScript frameworks on a Webflow site. So that's going to be next Friday. JavaScript frameworks on
Yeah.
a Webflow site. The Friday after that is how to work with Webflow CMS API. So these are really good episodes. They're going to be really valuable. So please come next week. And yeah, we're going to keep this technical conversation going. Alex, any final comments for the audience here?
Thank you for being here, as always.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye.